Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Morning of March 24th, Tuesday morning. Hope you're all doing well. Weather outside, a little cloudy and overcast, but we've had some gorgeous days here, right? If you're gonna have to be quarantined and told to stay away from people, you can still get outside, get some sunshine, get some fresh air, as long as it's nobody else's air, and hopefully keep yourself up and well. In front of me, I have the PowerPoint rolling here on the left. I have the slides that you'll see, as well as some notes I want to make sure I make along the way here. I have my study guide and I have an agenda. So here's what I'd like to do today. I would like to talk about the old assignment that we turned in. I would like then to talk about a new one, and I'll explain to you what that is, and then I'll give you a sense as to what the next week or so holds for us. And then I want to cover material. When we get going on the study guide, we're going to be on the top of page 3 right up here, where it asks us about U.S. foreign policies in the 1920s. And then after that, we'll probably get our way through most of page 4, maybe not all. We'll see how that rolls, but I'm going to put that aside for a second. So, some old business. There's one assignment in the grade book. That's the assignment on the FDR cartoon, which most people have turned in, and I have corrected, and it's back to you. If you haven't turned one in, please turn one in. If there's some kind of a communication link problem, that is to say you can't get Remind, Google, email, anything to work, then let's try and figure out some other way in which you can be turning in the work. But if you're watching this video and you know you haven't turned one in, get on it, ladies and gentlemen. Otherwise, there'll be another assignment. This one's going to be due on Thursday. That's 2 days from now. And that'll be an assignment that is a World War II short answer question that'll take some of the information we get today, maybe also some information from the last video of this unit, which I will churn out on Thursday. But that, as I said, short answer question for you will be due on Thursday. Now, where are we headed? Well, by the end of the week, we'll be through the end of this unit, through the end of 7B here, and the United States will have helped to win the Second World War. The war will be over, and we'll be heading on into the Cold War. And that means we're going to evaluate or assess at the end of this. I spoke on our last day together about the fact that testing in this environment cannot look normal, in a sense. It can't look multiple choice. And what I'm probably going to do is create a series of questions that ask you to, through writing, express that you understand the material and can evaluate it and can do some analysis and some critical thinking. In other words, I get that you're going to use your notes. I get that you're going to in some way be working on it in an environment that would be different from a normal test in my class. I don't think that means sit down together across the internet and work it out with your friends. And I don't think that that means take your friends' answers and write them down. I don't think any of you would want to think that, but let's not think that. And let's not do that for sure. And I'll probably send that out to you sometime at the end of the week here, I imagine, and then that will be due in the middle of next week. I don't expect you to work over the weekend. That's your time, and I expect that you should be doing these things on weekdays only. So I hopefully am budgeting this in such a sense that if you spend some time during the week, then you certainly don't have to do anything on the weekends. That's my goal. All right, that's the agenda of things. Obviously, if there's anything I'm not talking about that you're worried about, if you have concerns about, hit me up about that. Let me reorganize my notes for a brief moment, and we will be on our way, ladies and gentlemen. Give us a second here. Okay, there we are. All right, everyone ready to roll? Top of the third page, talking about American foreign policies in the 1920s and 1930s. Let's go. First thing to keep in mind, the context of things. 1920, let's go back in our brain. In 1920, America is a year and a half after the First World War. A First World War that we reluctantly got into late, that we eventually wished we had not gotten into, it seems. We don't join the League of Nations. We don't agree to the final Treaty of Versailles. And really, if you look at it, America sleeks into what's becoming a very isolationist mode. Now, over on the other side of the pond in the 1920s and 30s, things get dicey. The French, the Germans, and the British, largely because of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, are going to get into it over money. America's going to step in briefly in order to help that out. But really, the problems created by Versailles are going to create economic and political issues that the United States is not really going to want to have a part in. We don't want to get over there and try and slow the roll of Hitler. We don't want to somehow stop Mussolini's expansion in Africa Or if we want to go to the other side of the world, look at what the Japanese are doing in Manchuria and have to get in the way of that. America in the 1920s, as we've talked about, is highly successful in business, and the business model is working well for us. So there isn't a large movement to suddenly switch that. It's as though we had a period of about 20 years of internationalism, where we had the Spanish-American War, and we built the Panama Canal, and we had World War I, and now we've come to a point where we think that was good enough. These other countries, we were told by Washington a long time ago that their drama was really bad drama. And he was right. We do not have any interest in getting involved with the age-old affairs of the Europeans. Now, one of the things we do get involved with is arms reduction. So across the 1920s and 30s, you'll see the United States agreeing to international accords that in essence say, we're a country of A size, and therefore we're allowed to have this many types of ships, this many types of planes, and this many types of soldiers. And then a country of a smaller size, say for instance Germany or Italy or Britain or France, would say, well, our population is, 2/3 A, and therefore we're allowed to have the same ratio across. That there's this idea in the 1920s that stems out of the Treaty of Versailles that if we can somehow build a coalition of peace, that we can make armament not a problem. We can slow down the pace of armament to assure that people are not going to be out of control with what they have. Okay. At the bottom of the slide here, I mention here what's called the good neighbor policy. We have not been a good neighbor to our Latin American friends. And so the United States, under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and somewhat at the end of the 1920s as well, are going to try and put on a better face. If you don't remember what I mean here, for large portions of the 1920s, there are U.S. troops in countries in Central America and in the Caribbean where the United States is in essence saying, you're part of our hemisphere, you're not behaving correctly, or your country's not behaving correctly, and we're going to get involved in order to stop it. The United States is going to withdraw those troops, that's part A. We're also going to try and send aid packages to the countries in order to help them out, which on the surface is going to look great. Here's the problem though. A lot of the times, the leaders that we're helping out there are not great human beings. And this becomes the lingering ugliness of the 20s and 30s. Both under the Republicans of the 20s and the Democrat Franklin Roosevelt of the 30s, some of the people that the United States gets in league with in Latin American countries are some nasty human beings. There are right-wing, hard dictators that we get into alliance with because they're going to protect American business interests in the area or because they're an important strategic ally. And in the long run, that's going to be a negative as well. So we think we're putting forward a better foot here. And in that moment, in that historical moment, it absolutely looks that way. But when you give it 20, 30, 40 years of ripple, you begin to see that unfortunately what the United States is doing in those places is not the best for those places. And that's going to lead to even more guff from those countries towards the U.S. So there's a variety of different things in this slide, but to sum it up, we're an isolationist nation. We do not have an interest in being involved with the affairs of the rest of the world from a military standpoint. The U.S. is going to sit aside and not get involved with these things as long as we can. Okay, now, that crosses that off. If you look on the study guide, there's a study guide. There's this long chart. What's that? A chart on a holiday study guide? Nah, that's right, a chart. And in each of these moments, we're going to track how the United States position towards the rest of the world is evolving. That is to say, are we becoming more involved with the world? Are we not? And then we're going to eventually kind of find our way down here. If you notice at the bottom, December 7th of 41, which, as you know, is the Pearl Harbor Day. But what we want to keep an eye on is whether or not the United States is behaving in a way that's, to borrow the language here, isolationist. That is to say, are we staying out of the affairs of the world? Interventionist, are we more prone to intervene, to get involved, or perhaps a mix of both? Okay, so as we go down here and as we cover these slides, we have to keep that in mind. Number one, the 1934 Nye Committee. The Nye Committee is brought together by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota. Nye wanted to investigate why the United States got involved with World War One. And in a sense, what Nye's trying to do is what you should do. He's trying to have a moment of national self-reflection. We've given it now 15 years. Let's look at why we got involved with these events, and let's try and figure out what it was that drew the United States into this horrendous experience that in the long run we regretted. And so Nye has a look into things, and Nye's committee, this Senate committee, comes up with the idea that the war was really the work of moneymakers, that it was a group of merchants and bankers, people who had put out money to France and Britain and were worried that they weren't going to get it back, and that they were the ones driving American policy and driving American involvement with the countries of Europe. And he phrased this group, fantastic group, the Merchants of Death, right? If you're looking to open a garage band at any point, that is a swell name. Opening at Jerry's Pizza on Tuesday, Merchants of Death. That kind of music, like really kind of intense. Maybe you're going, that's not really intense, Holiday. Fine. Whatever's with you people. All right, just kidding. So is that isolationist, interventionist, I beg your pardon? This is definitely isolationist, right? What Nye's doing is saying, how did we get in trouble the last time? Now let's not do it again. So that's a very isolationist moment. Okay, followed by the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts in both 35 and 36, and you notice we split them up here, 35 and 36, try to avoid the errors of World War I. Now, you can look at this and say, wow, Holiday, I don't get why we're passing this legislation. It seems a bit arbitrary. No, my friend. There is a purpose. The 1935 Neutrality Act bans trade with belligerents. A belligerent is a country in a war. So what the United States is saying is, when things get dicey, we are not going to be selling goods to people who are involved in the war. Okay, now a couple of things to keep in mind contextually. What this really means is we're going to stay out of the European and the Asian side of things, because in both of those sectors, aggression is taking place. We're seeing the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and also the Fascist Party in Italy, both of whom have expansionist mindsets. And in a more right now sense, we're watching the Japanese on the other side of the world conquer parts of Asia. And what the U.S. is saying is we're not selling to them. Now keep in mind where we are when we say that. When we say that in 1935, we are in the absolute toilet of the Depression. Here we are, the United States of America. We could make good money. We could absolutely maybe drag ourselves out of this depression more quickly by selling to those people. We're saying, no, we will not do it. We're not going to give you any sort of goods. That's what the first Neutrality Act is saying. The second Neutrality Act says we're not going to loan you any money. It also has another small portion on there that says you can't travel on the boats of belligerent nations, right? If you look at it, it's how do we avoid World War I? Basically, that's like we're not having another Lusitania moment. You can't travel on the boats of belligerent nations. None of that. Okay, so both of these, the Neutrality Act of 35 and 36, are solid isolationist policies. The United States saying, we're not doing it. We're not getting involved with this. We are not going to get dragged into another one of these wars. Now, here's the problem with that. Sometimes those conflicts involve people who are good people who would be nice to support. If you look at the Spanish Civil War, an event that you cover maybe more on the world history, European history side, you have this fascist, Francisco Franco, who is fighting against the legitimate democratic government of Spain. And the fascist side is getting help from the Germans and the Italians. And the democratic side, unfortunately, would love to get some support from the United States, and we won't give it to them. We won't sell them any goods. Now, there's a lot of Americans who go off and fight in that crusade, right? This is a great Hemingway moment, is you go and fight in that war, in the Spanish Civil War. But what the government policy is we really can't help out. Even if you're a good person, even if you're the right side of the conflict, We can't help you here. So isolationism has its real temptations. It has this moment of thinking, I'm doing the right thing, I'm not getting involved with this. But you also have to keep in mind that then it allows the world to do its thing. You could see the same thing today. I know coronavirus is dominating the news, but if the United States peeled back from the world and we brought home our troops who are in places like Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Germany and the Ukraine, you would watch the nasties of the world expand their influence. That's the problem with isolationism. It feels good in the short run, but in the long run, if you're not out there monitoring your entire garden, weeds are going to grow. And that's the problem you're going to have. Okay? Okay, 1937, cash and carry. We're going to start edging towards the isolationist switch here towards a more interventionist tone. What does that mean? We're coming out of our shell a bit. Roosevelt's beginning to realize that at some point we may have to get involved here. Roosevelt gives a speech called the Quarantine Speech in the mid-1930s, where he speaks about how the good nations of the world have to help one another in order to drive the bad nations of the world into isolation and into decline, if you will. And one of the things that we're going to try and do to pop the world here, to help out, is called the cash and carry plan. Here's how this works. You have to pay for anything you buy from us, okay? No loans, no credit. That way we don't have to get into a war to help you out. And secondly, we have to have it sold on our dock. You put it on your ship and you take it home. Cash on the spot, and you carry it home. This is a nice middle point of isolationism and interventionism. So if I'm looking at my chart over here, notice those two words are right at the top. If you're like, how do you spell that? It's right there. Isolation and interventionism. Okay? You have to take it home yourself. What does that mean? If it gets sunk by your enemy 8 miles off the shore of the United States, hey, don't call us. Sorry, man. Your boat got sunk. Boat better. I don't know what you want me to tell me. Okay? Avoid the troubles of these things if you can. Okay? But this is the United States in a little bit of a way coming out of our shell, okay? Now, I have in here a few public survey polls, and these are not intended for you to need them in your notes or anything, but I have them here so that you can get a sense of what's going on. So this one says October 2nd, 1938. By this point, by the way, Hitler has remilitarized, the German economy is in full flush, and Hitler is pushing himself into places like Czechoslovakia and Austria in the short run. If England and France go to war against Germany, do you think the U.S. can stay out of it? 57% of Americans say, yes, we can. And in the next one, okay, when we see the war begin on September 1st, 1939, if it appears that Germany is defeating England and France, should the U.S. declare war and send our army and navy to Europe to fight? 77% no. That's huge. When you think about it, in the span of interventionism or isolationism, that is a very isolationist America. Roosevelt can see that this is a conflict that eventually we might have to do something about, right? Again, that the problem with isolationism is it allows the nasties, and then really if you asked Roosevelt what he thought of Hitler, that's what he would have said, kind of an absolute gangster who had been able to push people around because of weak moments. If you allow those people their moments, eventually you're going to have to do something about the problem. So Roosevelt has a real issue here. Financially, getting into the war would be good. Politically, it might be good for him. Internationally, there's no doubt it would be good for the world if the United States got in there. But the United States doesn't want any part of it. America is staying out of it intellectually here. At least this poll is going to tell us that. When Roosevelt runs for office here in a minute, we'll see how he's posed to stay out of this war. America's going to try and fight this war without fighting it, by staying out of it. In 1914, when the war began, Woodrow Wilson had said that Americans must remain neutral. And now Roosevelt is saying you must remain neutral as well. You must not choose a side. Now in World War I, it's harder to pick a side. In other words, there's not a clear bad guy. In World War II, there's a clear bad guy. Okay, so as much as Americans are going to stay neutral, they probably have a favorite in this one. Okay? Next one here. destroyer deal. In September of 1940, the United States made a deal. This is Franklin Roosevelt wheeling and dealing on the side with the British to trade them 50 old destroyers, okay, that we had that we could give to the British in return for the rights to build naval bases on British property anywhere in the world. This is a pretty crafty deal you got here, Franklin Roosevelt. Again, this is probably a middle ground between the isolationist and the interventionist. But what Roosevelt's saying is, I tell you what, I am going to allow us to get around cash and carry here. This is something that you don't have to buy because I know you don't have any cash, and Britain does not. And in a carry sense, it carries itself. You take these ships from us and you sail them across the Atlantic. Now, there's no guarantee that's going to be an easy thing. Great movie coming out in, looks like May, June-ish, Greyhound. Tom Hanks, watched the trailer yesterday. Ooh, looking good. Looking good. You're interesting, kind of World War II war movie. I think Hanks has a big role in writing the script. It's about an American vessel and its attack on these German U-boats. Ooh, looks good. Looks good. Tom Hanks getting over the coronavirus, too. All that doesn't matter, Holiday. Stay on task. Okay. Now, is this the U.S. getting involved in the war? It isn't really, but it's Roosevelt finding a crafty way to help out a friend, Winston Churchill, with a little bit of fighting the war without having to pay for it. So again, he's walking a middle line, okay? I've got my slides out of order, if you'll pardon me. Here's the next one. Here we go. 1940 election. Wait a moment, Holiday. Wait a moment. I can do math. Franklin Roosevelt ran for president in 1932. He ran for president in 1936. That's 2 terms. Have a nice day. Adios. That's what you think, right? Pardon me. No. Roosevelt's going to say that the economic problems of America, we still aren't really out of the Depression, and the growing storm of the world necessitates him sticking around. And so what Roosevelt wants to say to you is, listen, I think I need to run for a 3rd term. The crisis demands it. And Roosevelt runs for a 3rd term, and in fair play to him, if you look at the slide here, besides a solid chunk in the heartland in the Great Plains of America, Roosevelt does really well. The man he runs against here, Wendell Willkie, the Republican, is a pretty big fan of Franklin Roosevelt, to be frank. He's a big fan of New Deal programs. He supported America's foreign policy. He's very close to Franklin Roosevelt on political ideas. Okay, Wendell Willkie, and Willkie is going to lose. Roosevelt will be elected to a 3rd term. What I want you to notice about the slide, though, look at that slogan right there. I won't send your boys to any foreign wars. Soon. We will be at war soon, my friends. It's kind of ironic, right? In 1916, when Woodrow Wilson won his 2nd term, his slogan was, he kept us out of war. And then we were in war about 8 months later. And here is Franklin Roosevelt saying, I won't send your boys to any foreign wars. And then we are in the war 14 months later. Huh, how funny. Kind of a weird one there, Franklin Roosevelt. All right. In between here and our next item here, we've got the destroyer deal done. We're headed to Lend-Lease, okay? I want to mention, just as a side note, just for fun stuff, there's a huge group of Americans pulling together at this point to avoid American presence in a foreign war. Again, this is not a study guide item, but this is one of those items I like to include because it's an interesting twist called the AFC, the America First Committee. America First Committee believed that neutrality and isolationism was the big thing. Its biggest spokespersons in America, Charles Lindbergh, who had risen to fame as the man who had flown across the Atlantic, and also the industrialist Henry Ford. Ford, who was doing a thriving trade with the Germans in order to build tanks and all sorts of cool weaponry for the Reich. Hey, it's business, I suppose, right? It's kind of ironic when Schindler's List, which is a movie that's a very graphic, hard movie to watch. When Schindler's List came out, and when it was first shown on television, the Ford Motor Company paid for a commercial-free, unedited run of Schindler's List on TV. The movie, as I said, is very graphic. It's not the sort of thing you should put on television, but they went unedited, commercial-free, sponsored by Ford. And you always look at it and you go, Ford, that company that built all that hardware for the Nazis. Just a little bit of guilt there. Just a little bit of guilt you have to understand, I think. Okay. Nice little side story. Okay, March 1941, Lend-Lease. This, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Okay? The moment of pause. The moment where I say, stop the presses, and the United States is never going back. Lend-Lease is a program that allows the United States to give any military, civilian, food, whatever item we'd like to give to a foreign nation in order to help them to combat aggression anywhere in the world. Lend-Lease is us beginning what we will consider to be the interventionist United States that still lives and breathes in 2020. In other words, this is the moment where the curtain comes back, the stage lights go, and we begin the United States of America as we know it today. A foreign policy power that does not back off of the stage. There are moments where we're going to be more involved, and you could say less involved, I suppose, but from here on out, we are involved. Okay, now this doesn't commit us to fighting in the war, but from a standpoint of taking a side and trying to make that side successful, this is a turning point for the United States. Okay, the U.S. is going to put together an aid package in the billions of dollars that we are putting money out to all of these places around the world. Okay, these are people who are fighting against the Axis. So it's a really odd set of characters, right? The Soviet Union's going to be here in one point. Nationalist China, keep in mind, not communist China, that one comes later, but nationalist China, the British, the French, anyone who's fighting aggression around the world, we've got stuff for you, right? Roosevelt compared this to a fire hose. If your neighbor's house goes up in flames in the middle of the night, you, as the owner of a firehouse, or fire hose, I beg your pardon, don't stand there and negotiate prices and say, well, you know, Joe, I'd be happy to sell you a hose or loan you the use of the hose, but unfortunately it's against the law. You don't do that. You get the hose, you hook the damn hose up, and you help put out the fire. Because that's what a good neighbor would do. That's how you responsibly aid in the effort. Roosevelt here is getting closer and closer to understanding that the United States needs to be a part of this. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, is saying to Roosevelt, you got to get in here. You got to help us with this crisis. And by that he means real soldiers, not just money. But the United States is in its best moment here. We become this production dynamo. More on that in a moment, okay? But speaking of the relationship with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in August of 1941, before the United States has entered World War II, I'm going to say that again because it matters, before the United States has entered World War II, this is an agreement that we make, okay? Lend-Lease, we checked off here, right? If you're like, was that isolationist or interventionist? Interventionist, big time, okay? Atlantic Charter is going to be interventionist as well. In August of 1941, in what turns out to be kind of like a boys' weekend, Churchill and Roosevelt sneak away, lying to their wives about where they're going, top secret kind of stuff, and maneuver themselves from Britain and from Washington, D.C., off the coast of Newfoundland onto a ship in order to negotiate what the world will look like after we win the Second World War. That is some chutzpah. That is some absolute brass. We're not going to sit down and talk about if we win the Second World War. We're going to talk about when we win the Second World War. Roosevelt and Churchill saying, all right, here we go. This is what the world's going to look like. This is what we're fighting for. We are going to sacrifice lives, and we are going to sacrifice all of this money, and when we do it, we are going to purchase something. Now, Roosevelt here, let's put this in its right context, is slightly being Wilsonian. In other words, we can create a peaceful world order that lives up to certain value systems. Now, we laughed at Woodrow Wilson in 1919 for that. We said that's slightly unrealistic. And Roosevelt's not out here saying we'll never have a war again. But what he's saying is we owe it to future generations to create a more stable understanding of how you have peace and how you have individual liberties for human beings. And that is what he and Churchill sit down and hammer out, an agreement called the Atlantic Charter, okay? Part of it, we are going to create democratic societies, societies that reflect what groups of people within the state want to have, not societies that are ruled by gangsters, or what that was the phrase that Roosevelt most often used for Hitler, was that he was a gangster. But dictators or people who are brigands and armed thug type folk. That's not something that should rule the world. Okay. Roosevelt, shortly afterwards, gives a speech in which he claims that the fighting of World War II is the pursuit of four freedoms. Okay, four freedoms. Two of these make sense. The other two are a little more like, I'm not sure I get that holiday. Freedom number one, the freedom of speech, the ability of any human anywhere to say what it is they want to say. Okay, that is a fundamental liberty that if you look at both the United States and Britain is woven in. You can go back to the Magna Carta, you can go to the English Bill of Rights in the 1680s, you can look at the writings of John Locke, you can then go with the Constitution or the Declaration or however you want to do it, but that is a major important thing. The freedom of worship, that the freedom of religious practice anywhere in the world should be as it is, okay? And then the other two, as I said, are a little more, the freedom from want. You should be able to live a life where you are no longer worried about whether or not you'll have enough. Roosevelt imagines a peaceful world, an economically driven capitalist world in which everyone has enough. That is the goal here, a freedom from want. And likewise, a freedom from fear. You should not be living your life worrying about what is essentially aggression and bullying of nations. Okay, so that's what we're going to create. Now, together they agree to a post-World War II organization that when we get down the road will be the United Nations, but that's an important thing, right? Keep in mind what Roosevelt just said. When this is all said and done, not only will we still be on the stage, we're going to be standing at the center of that stage. Okay, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson wanted that, but he couldn't get that. The United States was harshly against that notion. In World War II, we're not going to be able to get off that stage. Why? There's going to be a Soviet Union standing there that's saying, hey, America, you can get off the stage. We'll take care of all this. With some sort of like rueful Russian chuckle going there, right? No thanks. Okay, I have a chart here. And you know I love a good chart. But I just wanted to show you the amount of production the United States is going to put together here. So if you'll humor me for a moment, let's look at some numbers together. Okay, the United States is listed at the top, I beg your pardon, in their production of aircrafts and tanks, which, as you can tell, in 1940 is not all that high. But look at us by the time we get up to years like 1942, 43, 44, 45. Okay, look at it compared to the German and Japanese combined effort at the bottom. Look at years like 1942, where the United States makes 48,000 planes, 25,000 tanks, and the Germans and the Japanese, who by this point are not really being hit yet, in other words, this is peak production capacity, manage half of that. We are that kind of industrial powerhouse, right? Winston Churchill calls us the arsenal for democracy. That's what we are. What is America's great additional World War II? We make stuff. Yes, we're going to go to places and we're going to die and we're going to make important stands, but the greatest individual contribution by a nation is that we make things here. We can make you a large ship in a day. We can make you a plane in 5 minutes. You think I made that up? No, look it up. That's the truth. How about this one? I read this fact yesterday and I was like, that is gold. You ready? In 1944, America spent on World War II twice as much as the entire federal budget of the United States for the prior 150 years combined. What? Truly, that must be made up. Nah, I can show you where I read it. It's reliable. We spent in 1 year on World War II twice as much as the 150 years prior combined. What? We are spending $250 million a day on World War II. So, the next time someone says, where'd all this debt come from? A variety of places. One of those places, though, is the fighting of the Second World War and the runoff, the Cold War afterwards. Okay? And the next time someone says, America, oh my God, what have they ever done? This right here. Save the world from the Nazis, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not supposed to be partisan about it. I'm not supposed to stand here and say this is the political party I support, and I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if you want to run America down the road, you may want to look back at the Second World War and say, man, that was pretty good of what you did there. That was solid. Okay, now, the people who are going to be snarky are going to be like, well, you did it for your own self-interest. Okay, I suppose. You can't win that argument eventually. What are we supposed to do? Lay down, let the Nazis conquer us, and be like, we're so giving, we'll give you the nation? No, this is just a brief holiday rant, but here's the rant. Man, we did some nice stuff in World War II. So there's that, okay? Moving along. Japanese aggression here. Now, we switch here in a quick sense to what's going on the Japanese side of the world. And it bears mentioning that what draws us into the war, right, isn't what's going on the German, Italian side. It's really this Pacific side. And this really has to do with the Japanese and their aggression. So this first slide that I have here, aggression in the East led to trade restrictions with Japan. That's gonna be that first box, okay? And then there's another box there for December 7th, 1941 for Pearl Harbor. What's going on here, Holiday? Well, the Japanese, much like the Germans and the Italians, see themselves in a fascist mindset. They see themselves as the right-wing totalitarian power of their region. The Japanese have started to take over the territories of East Asia. They've done so in Korea. They've gobbled up islands throughout the South Pacific region. It might sit in the back of your memory, but in 1905, they went to war against the Russians to expand their territory and did so. And the Japanese are pushing further and further. And what the United States is saying to the Japanese is knock it off. And the reason that we're saying it is to try and avoid a larger conflict in Asia. The reason the Japanese are trying to conquer everything in sight is, if you think of mainland Japan, it's a rather small, under-resourced island. The Japanese don't have the great weapons of war when you look at fuel and oil and sheet metal and scrap and rubber and things like that. In fact, there's a lot of cool stories you can see in California newspapers where Japanese agents are in the United States and they're buying scrap metal, right? The Depression's going on, and they're buying anything they can find. And they're taking it back to Japan and they're turning it into the machines of war. It's good environmental recycling, Holiday, I guess. Okay, but the Japanese refuse to back down, and as they expand more and more, the United States says to them, knock it off, and eventually we embargo trade against them. We limit what it is we're willing to sell them. And that leads the Japanese to a animal in the corner mentality, that you do one thing now. You have to figure out how to get out of this situation, and that is going to be that you just attack. And the attack on Pearl Harbor is foolhardy, let's be honest with each other. It's never really going to have its desired effect of knocking the United States completely out of World War II, or out of the Pacific, I suppose. They're not in the war yet. But it's the Japanese saying, we have really one shot here, and that shot is to try and cripple the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and in doing so, allow ourselves a sphere of influence in the Pacific. That's the goal. And the Japanese fail at that. Unfortunately for them, they don't get the ships they need. The carriers are not sitting in the harbor that day. And as that's the case, the United States is able to build the military back up from there. There's a pretty sweet movie about this last year, Midway, right? The battle that comes, the first big battle for America after Pearl Harbor, that's a decisive naval victory for the United States. But it isn't for Japan what they hoped it would be. Japan thought that they were getting out of this, the United States being knocked out of the Pacific, and unfortunately that's just not going to happen for them. It does, though, bring a declaration of war from the United States, and it brings the U.S. into it, and there's that. I'd like to go on. I know we're about 40 minutes here, but let's keep rolling, ladies and gentlemen. I want to go on to this next page here. This will go a little bit more quickly, and I want to finish out maybe at the bottom of Japanese internment here, and then we'll pick up the last in another video in a couple days. But here we go. World War II government agencies. We kind of have to shift now. In fact, I got a cartoon. A student sent me this, and I'm forgetting which student it is, but I think it was Duncan. If it's Duncan, hey, Duncan. And the cartoon had a bunch of Roosevelt's guys riding a horse, and it was called the New Deal. The horse was called the New Deal, and the horse is like, walking off to the side, and Roosevelt is sitting in a car that says, win the war. The car's like, win the war, the win the war car. And what the point of the cartoon is that Roosevelt is saying, hey, fellas, that thing over there is done. That New Deal thing, put that away. Put the horse in the barn, literally. Get in the car. We got another issue to fight here, and it's sort of a transition. And Roosevelt is saying now all of this progressive organization that might have 40 years ago looked like Teddy Roosevelt and national parks and the Food and Drug Administration, and in the New Deal looked like the CCC and the progress of jobs and all of these things, now looks like the OPA, the Office of Price Administration, which is going to manage prices, consumption, rent. What's the picture holiday? That's the daily ration, not the daily ration, sorry, that's a lot. The weekly ration of a person, right? America's going to go to a ration system. I attach a video here that talks about rations. It's kind of a cartoony deal, kind of just fun to see how they try to entertain people during the war. But Americans, especially on essential items, you're seeing there like your fats, your lard, your butter, your cheese, your meats, your bacon, that's going to be strictly rationed. So Craig Holiday would get a ration book that looks like this. I'd go down to the store and they'd say, okay, Holiday, what are you buying? And I'd buy these things. They'd be like, okay, pay how much it costs, and you have to pay for it, keep in mind. And then you have to be like, okay, there's a bacon stamp. Oh, hang on. And I got a butter stamp for you. And I also have here, this one I'm going to buy some a can of beans. And there I am. There's my ration stamps. What happens if you lose the ration book? Whoo, you're in a bad way. I hope you grew a victory garden or have very nice neighbors, because really you've got nothing else to do with. Okay. The organization of people during World War II is intense. Stat for you, unemployment in 1940 was still 14%. So in spite of all the work of the New Deal, unemployment in 1940 sat at 14%. By 1943, it was at 2%. Americans of all backgrounds, races, colors are going to come into the workforce during World War II. There's massive jobs to be had, and that's a big switch for the United States, okay? Office of War Information, the propaganda machine. Now this is an image that is pretty stark. I like this photo because it says, this is the enemy. In case you ever see that guy walking down the street in Lamont, you're supposed to say, oh, that's the enemy. But to be serious about it, the Office of War Information was absolutely ruthless in its depiction of the enemy. What in World War I might have been a tad playful and, having the German Kaiser overwhelmed by a big American nickel or something like that. In World War II, it is bloodthirsty, right? Particularly against the Japanese. Nobody is going to get worse than the Japanese. The Japanese are compared to all sorts of animals and creatures, and the Japanese, the anti-Japanese propaganda is absolutely nuts out there. There's a lot of Warner Brothers cartoons you can go and watch that have some solid racism in them. And there's a war going on, I get it, but the racism in there is crazy. One of the guys who I'm always surprised who survived the sort of post-revisionist backlash is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss worked for the U.S. Army during World War II, doing, a lot of this propaganda, and some of the cartoons that he comes up with, they are off sides. And somehow that's all kind of been able to stay in the background, and people continue to buy the Places You Go and the Cat and the Hat, and there's a Walk It in My Pocket, and there's some other ones. Yeah, random aside, okay? Women in World War II. World War II is a great time of change, okay? Women, in particular, going to be working in the war here in an industrial sense, right? This is the largest stretch of married woman employment in American history up until this point. In other words, women who had a family or still had a family, perhaps going back into the job force, working in a variety of different ways. Generally, it's industrial stuff, and taking jobs. Now, these jobs are generally pretty high paying, and women enjoy the labor. It's fun work. It's a good time overall, okay? That's the Rosie the Riveter image. You've seen that, I imagine. But 36% of the workforce were women. You also see, just as a side note here, a huge push in the African-American population. Again, a second great migration as people push out of the South a second time, and also to California. If you're looking for kind of the birthplace of that booming California economy, right here in World War II. $1 in $10 spent in World War II is spent in the great state of California. It is not close to the Nazis on the East Coast, and it's far enough away from the Japanese on the West Coast. It's a perfect place to build some stuff, okay? Now, women are also going to volunteer in non-combat roles. Drivers, clerical work, assistants, aides, people who are in the medical profession, all of those things, women who are important. I put a video here if you feel like watching that. It's a pretty good little video that details a lot of the work being done by women in the variety of roles. It's a big push. Now, what we'll see as a result of that after World War II is kind of a second wave of feminist move now. Now that we've got the right to vote gained after the First World War, we'll start seeing a more active push push of women. Now, in the very quick portion after the war, women are going to be pushed towards more domestic roles, right? The average age of a woman getting married right after World War II is like 18 and a half. Marry your soldier boyfriend, have some babies, live in the suburbs. But soon afterwards, you'll start seeing the push of a feminist movement that's going to be talking about pay and college attendance and childcare and contraception and abortion rights, and a big push of the women's movement coming our way, okay? I want to finish here with Executive Order 9066, the internment of the Japanese. In World War II, Franklin Roosevelt makes the decision to intern Japanese Americans in camps because they were considered to be a threat to national security. There was no evidence at that point that the Japanese Americans were a threat to national security. There was no great evidence during the war that they did anything of that nature. And so in the retrospect of things, this is something that looks like an overreaction, absolutely. But it's something that Roosevelt thinks is along the lines of Schenck versus the United States, or Lincoln putting secessionist leaders in jail in Maryland in the Civil War. It's something you might do in order to try and police your country during a time of conflict. And therefore, it's something that Roosevelt is going to push. Now, in the midst of the war, there's a Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, that questions whether or not this is legitimate. And like with the Schenck case, because of the context and the situation, Korematsu's case is going to go in favor of the United States, the U.S. saying, or I beg your pardon, the government saying that the United States is rightful in interning the Japanese. A little over 100,000 Japanese Americans are moved off of the west coast of the United States. There are places where no Japanese Americans are interned. There are places like Hawaii, for instance, where the Japanese American population is quite large, and therefore they don't try to intern anyone because it would have been a lot of the civil society. There are plenty of Japanese Americans who fight in the war. The most decorated group in the entire Second World War is a group called the 442nd, which is Japanese Americans fighting in the Italian side of the Second World War. One of them, Senator Daniel Inouye, goes on to serve in the U.S. Senate from the great state of Hawaii. He was our senator for a long time. He lost his arm in World War II. Fantastic human being, okay? I want to put a little BHS spin on it. This, and I know that's backwards, so trust me, I understand when you say it. This is from the Blue and White. Yes, that Blue and White. The Blue and White, May 1942. The headline, I beg your pardon, Japanese American students present their farewell to KC High. Now, I want you to understand that these are young people who are a month away from graduation, some of them. And some of them are a year away from graduation, and some of them are younger than that, I suppose. But here they are, and they're going to be pulled out of Kern County Union High School, and they're going to be sent, most of them, to Manzanar and to other internment camps around the state of California and the West Coast. And this is how they said goodbye. The evacuation of Japanese people from Bakersfield is now about to begin, and the students who are leaving take this opportunity to say goodbye for a while. As most of you know by this time, we are a people of very few words. Therefore, we should like to express our appreciation with two short but expressive words. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hedge and the counselors, for your encouraging words and generous support in helping us to adjust ourselves to the emergency which is borne upon us. Thank you, members of the faculty, for your helping hand and the interest you have always taken in Japanese students. Students, we have enjoyed working with you, and your fellowship will never be forgotten. Since evacuation is only of military necessity for the duration of the war, we look forward to returning to Bakersfield, where we may once more take our place with the other youths of America. In closing, we say good health, good luck, and may we soon be together in a peaceful world. The Japanese American students of Kern County Union High School. That is some class, right? If I were being chucked out of a place, I think I would have much more choice language than that. They did not, okay? Now, if you're looking at the picture and you're saying, Holiday, what's that picture? And I hope you do look at the picture, because that is one of the sweetest things you're ever going to see. 2003, does that picture, that looks familiar, Holiday. What's in the background there? That looks like, that's the old bleachers at BHS. That's fantastic. In 2003, my colleague, Mr. Hooper, maybe you've seen him around, he's got a big beard. Mr. Hooper and his archiving students found the students who were set to graduate from Kern County Union High School, in 1942, and some of them, I believe, in 1943, and they graduated them 60 years later with the graduating class of 2003. That, ladies and gentlemen, is really cool. Go ahead, find some folks, put them out there, and say, you missed your chance. Let's do this the right way. I think that's fantastic. Okay, so that's a picture of the Japanese American students, surviving Japanese American students, I should say, on the front lines there. Okay. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you are well. This is a rather long video, so good luck with everything else that's going on here. Take care of yourselves. As I said, I'm going to post a new assignment here later on this morning. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.